The night air over Bataan stank of cordite and rot. It was the 8th of January, 1942, and Private First Class Miguel Santos of the Philippine Scouts crouched in a foxhole that had been his home for 72 hours. His hands, calloused and dark with grime, gripped something the older Marines still weren't sure about, a rifle that weighed 9.5 pounds, fed from an 8-round clip, and fired without the soldier having to work a bolt between shots. The M1 Garand. Some of the old-timers had nicknamed it dismissively Grandma's gun, they'd muttered back at the depot in Manila, with all the contempt that veteran riflemen reserved for untested machinery. Too heavy, they said. Too complicated. A waste of ammunition in the hands of men who couldn't shoot straight anyway. But Miguel Santos wasn't thinking about what the veterans called it. He was listening. Somewhere in the black tangle of jungle beyond his position, the Japanese 14th Army was preparing to teach the American and Filipino defenders a lesson in Bushido, the way of the warrior. What Santos and the 11,000 defenders scattered across the Bataan Peninsula didn't know yet was that they were about to demonstrate something else entirely, that courage means nothing when you charge into a wall of semi-automatic fire. The sound came first as a whisper through bamboo. Then voices, rising in pitch. Then the shriek that would become familiar to every American who fought in the Pacific, "Banzai!" And the crash of men moving through undergrowth without any attempt at stealth. The Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized spirit over firepower, the supremacy of the bayonet charge, the inevitability of victory through superior will. It had worked against poorly armed Chinese conscripts. It would work here, too. It had to. Miguel Santos squeezed the trigger of his M1 Garand. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with the familiar recoil of the .30-06 cartridge, but his sight picture barely moved. Before the first Japanese soldier had fallen, Santos had fired again. And again. 8 rounds in the time it would have taken a bolt-action rifleman to chamber a second shot. The en-bloc clip ejected with its distinctive metallic ping, and Santos slammed another 8 rounds home without taking his eyes from the wall of men rushing his position. 40 yards. 30. 25. The mathematics of the attack were simple and brutal. A trained rifleman with an M1 could fire up to 50 aimed shots per minute. The Japanese Type 99 rifles opposing him could manage perhaps 15. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When dawn broke over the jungle that morning, there were bodies. So many bodies that Lieutenant Colonel Philip Fry, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 57th Regiment of Philippine Scouts, struggled to find words adequate to the carnage. The firepower of a battalion armed with modern weapons, he would later write in his report to General Douglas MacArthur, was something beyond his descriptive powers. The Garand rifle, he concluded, had changed the fundamental calculus of infantry combat. But understanding what had happened required stepping back further than that blood-soaked morning on Bataan. It required understanding the collision of two military philosophies, one rooted in the industrial might of American mass production, the other in the feudal traditions of Imperial Japan. And it required understanding a man named John Cantius Garand, who had been born in a farmhouse outside Montreal on the 1st day of January, 1888. John Garand was 11 years old when his family abandoned farming and moved to Connecticut, to the mill villages of New England where French-Canadian immigrants could find work. He became a bobbin boy in a textile mill at 12, his small hands threading yarn through machinery. But those hands learned. They learned forging, welding, steam engineering. The mechanical principles that would later allow him to design one of the most successful automatic weapons in history, using the same expanding gas principles that drove the textile mill's steam engines. By 1916, Garand's attention had turned to rifles. The Great War in Europe had demonstrated that the bolt-action weapons that had dominated warfare since the late 19th century were becoming obsolete. Machine guns ruled the battlefield, but they were heavy, crew-served weapons. What if that firepower could be distributed to individual riflemen? What if each soldier could generate the suppressive fire of several bolt-action shooters? In 1918, Garand submitted his first semi-automatic design to the United States Navy. It caught the attention of officials who invited him to continue his work at the Bureau of Standards in Washington. 18 months later, he was hired as an engineer at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. The weapon he would eventually patent in 1932 was revolutionary in its elegant simplicity. Where other designers had created complicated, failure-prone mechanisms, Garand's rifle used a long-stroke gas piston system beneath the barrel. When a round was fired, a small amount of expanding gas was bled through a port drilled in the barrel. This gas drove the piston rearward, which in turn rotated and unlocked a two-lug bolt, extracted the spent case, compressed a spring, and then, driven by that spring, stripped a fresh round from the integral magazine and chambered it. All the shooter had to do was pull the trigger again. The rifle fed from an en-bloc clip, a steel guide that held 8 rounds of .30-06 Springfield ammunition, and was inserted from the top of the receiver. When the last round was fired, the clip ejected automatically with that distinctive ping, and the bolt locked open, ready for a fresh clip to be inserted. The entire system weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded, nearly 11 pounds loaded. It was gas-operated, air-cooled, and capable of functioning in conditions that would jam or disable more temperamental weapons. But the United States Army of the 1930s didn't want it. The institution that had carried the M1903 Springfield rifle through the First World War and into the interwar years was deeply conservative, suspicious of change, and convinced that disciplined marksmanship, not volume of fire, won battles. The old salts, the NCOs who had earned their expert marksman badges with bolt-action rifles, feared the M1 would cost them their $5 per month bonuses if they couldn't maintain their qualification scores with the newfangled semi-automatic. It's inaccurate, they said. It wastes ammunition. It will jam. It's too big and heavy. Even the Marine Corps, which would later embrace the Garand with an almost religious fervor, initially rejected it. The Corps had used the Springfield rifle for almost 30 years. The Springfield was held in high regard for its long-range accuracy and reliable functioning under the harshest battlefield conditions. Why change what worked? The Marines tested and retested the M1, debates raging internally about its merits and demerits. They sent a few rifles to field units for evaluation. And they waited. The resistance only began to crumble when the United States Army officially adopted the M1 in 1936. Even then, production ramped up slowly. Springfield Armory built the rifles one at a time, carefully, while military budgets remained anemic and isolationist sentiment kept America's eyes turned inward. By the time Adolf Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, the Springfield Armory workforce numbered about 1,500 workers. But the writing was on the wall. Europe was at war. And as political turmoil spread across the world, American military spending began to increase. In 1940, Springfield Armory's budget increased by 250%. New facilities were built. Production methods improved. The workforce grew to nearly 7,500 by December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. And by then, a trickle of M1 rifles had begun reaching forward deployed units, including those in the Philippines. The men who first carried the M1 into combat were not elite troops. They were ordinary soldiers in Filipino auxiliaries, undersupplied and isolated on the far side of the Pacific, facing an enemy that had spent the previous decade perfecting the art of aggressive infantry assault in Manchuria and China. The Japanese soldier of 1941 was a veteran of brutal campaigns. He had been taught that spirit, sation, mattered more than material. That willpower could overcome firepower. That a properly executed bayonet charge, delivered with the scream of banzai, and absolute commitment to death, could break any defense. This wasn't empty propaganda. Japanese infantry tactics, honed through years of combat against Chinese forces equipped with outdated weapons and insufficient training, had proven devastatingly effective. The Type 99 Arisaka rifle that Japanese infantry carried was one of the finest bolt-action rifles of the Second World War, chambered in 7.7 mm. But it was still a bolt-action rifle, requiring the soldier to manually work the bolt between each shot. Against disorganized Chinese defenders, this limitation barely mattered. Against American and Filipino troops armed with M1 Garands, it would prove catastrophic. The American and Filipino defense of Bataan began in chaos. Following the Japanese landings on December 8, American forces had attempted to implement War Plan Orange 3, withdrawing into the Bataan Peninsula where they could hold out until reinforcements arrived from the United States. But there would be no reinforcements. The Pacific Fleet lay crippled at Pearl Harbor. Wake Island had fallen. Guam was gone. Singapore would fall in February. The men on Bataan were on their own, fighting with whatever weapons and ammunition they had managed to bring with them in the retreat. Among those weapons were approximately 3,000 M1 Garand rifles, issued to frontline units of the Philippine Scouts and some American infantry battalions between August and November 1941. The rest of the defenders carried M1903 Springfield rifles, leftover M1917 Enfields from the First World War, and in some cases weapons so old they predated the Spanish-American War. It was a hodgepodge arsenal for a desperate defense. And yet, those 3,000 Garands would make an outsized impact. The first major engagement came on the night of January 9 through 10, 1942, when Japanese forces launched a coordinated attack along the American defensive line. The assault followed the pattern that had brought Japan victory after victory: aggressive reconnaissance by infiltrators, followed by concentrated artillery fire, and then the infantry charge, bayonets fixed, voices raised in that terrible scream, relying on shock and speed to overwhelm the defenders before they could establish effective fire. It didn't work. The American and Filipino troops, dug into prepared positions with clear fields of fire, opened up with everything they had. Machine guns chattered. Mortars thumped. And the distinctive crack of the M1 Garand, faster than any rifle the Japanese had ever faced, created a wall of fire that turned the jungle floor into an abattoir. Japanese soldiers, trained to believe that American troops were soft and dependent on material luxuries, found themselves charging into a volume of fire they hadn't thought possible from individual riflemen. Captured Japanese soldiers, interrogated in the days following the failed assault, asked a question that would be repeated across the Pacific theater for the next 4 years: how was America able to arm every soldier with a machine gun? They weren't machine guns. They were M1 rifles. And they represented a fundamental shift in the nature of infantry combat that the Japanese High Command had failed to anticipate. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied ground forces in the Philippines from his headquarters on Corregidor, received reports from the front lines that bordered on the ecstatic. The M1 rifle, field commanders reported, operated with no mechanical defects even under the dirt and grime of foxhole fighting. Rifles that had been in almost constant action for a week without cleaning or lubrication continued to function. The firepower of a platoon armed with Garands rivaled that of a company armed with bolt-action rifles. On February 24, 1942, Major General Charles Wesson sent a telegram to the workers at the Winchester Repeating Arms Factory in New Haven, Connecticut. Here's a message from General MacArthur praising the superiority of the Garand rifle in combat. The general says that in the hands of our brave soldiers, the Garand operated with deadly precision even in the dust and dirt of foxhole fighting, and in many cases was in constant action for a week without cleaning or lubrication. This tribute from General MacArthur should be an inspiration for you men and women of Winchester who are now producing this remarkable weapon. But the defenders of Bataan were doomed. Cut off from resupply, ravaged by disease, subsisting on quarter rations, they held out until April 9, 1942, when nearly 75,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered, the largest capitulation in American military history. What followed was the Bataan Death March, a war crime that would claim more than 10,000 lives. The M1 Garands that had performed so admirably in combat were confiscated, studied, and in some cases shipped back to Japan for detailed technical analysis. Because even as the Japanese celebrated their victory in the Philippines, a disturbing pattern was emerging from every battlefield where their troops faced M1-equipped Americans. The Banzai Charge, that fundamental expression of Japanese military doctrine, was becoming suicide. In battle after battle across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Gilbert Islands, and eventually the Marianas, Japanese infantry found themselves cut down by semi-automatic fire before they could close to bayonet range. The tactical advantage that the M1 Garand provided wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming. A Marine rifle platoon equipped with Garands could sustain the same volume of fire as a company armed with bolt-action rifles. In the close-range jungle fighting of the Pacific, where opposing forces sometimes met each other in column formation on narrow paths, the penetrating power of the .30-06 cartridge meant that a single Marine could kill 2 or even 3 Japanese soldiers with one round. The heavy, full-power rifle cartridge didn't just wound, it created hydrostatic shock, shattered bones, and punched through palm trees, coconut logs, and human bodies with equal indifference. And the Marines, once they got their hands on enough M1s to fully equip their rifle companies, became absolute believers. The weapon that they had initially resisted, that they had tested and retested with conservative skepticism, proved itself in the crucible of Guadalcanal. Army reinforcements who arrived on the island in late 1942 and early 1943 brought M1s with them. Marines appropriated every rifle they could get their hands on, trading, borrowing, and in some cases simply acquiring rifles whose original owners no longer had use for them. The transformation of American firepower wasn't lost on Japanese military planners. By late 1943, as American forces steadily drove westward across the Pacific, capturing island after island in an inexorable advance toward the Japanese home islands, the Imperial Japanese Navy recognized that something had to be done about the American semi-automatic rifles. The problem was that the Imperial Japanese Army, which controlled most military production and doctrine, had already committed fully to the Arisaka rifle and showed no interest in developing a semi-automatic alternative. The Army's position was that proper training and superior spirit made mechanical innovations unnecessary. But the Navy, which had more independence in weapons development and whose special naval landing forces, the Rikusentai, were facing American Marines in the Pacific Island campaigns, took a different view. In the closing months of 1943, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal near Tokyo began a crash program to develop a semi-automatic rifle based on captured American M1s. The project was led by naval engineers who had studied the Garand's design in detail, stripping down captured rifles, measuring tolerances, analyzing metallurgy. Initially, they attempted simply to convert captured M1 rifles to fire the standard Japanese 7.7mm cartridge. The dimensions were similar to the American .30-06, and the conversion should have been straightforward. But it wasn't. The Japanese cartridge proved incompatible with the Garand's en-bloc clip system. The rim dimensions were slightly different, the case taper was wrong, and attempts to modify captured rifles ended in frustration and frequent malfunctions. Undeterred, the Yokosuka engineers decided to reverse engineer an entirely new rifle based on the M1's operating system. Reverse engineering sounds simple, just copy what works. In reality, it's often more difficult than original design, requiring exact measurements, metallurgical analysis, and the recreation of manufacturing processes without access to the original specifications or tooling. Nevertheless, by mid-1944, the arsenal had produced a working prototype. The Type 4 rifle, as it would be designated, bore an unmistakable resemblance to its American parent. It used a gas-operated, long-stroke piston system nearly identical to the M1's. It had a similar receiver, a two-lug rotating bolt, and a trigger guard safety. But there were differences. The Japanese version used a fixed, integral magazine that held 10 rounds and was loaded using two 5-round stripper clips inserted from the top of the receiver. The barrel was 1 inch shorter. The stock was made of mahogany rather than walnut, with reinforcing tangs and grasping grooves similar to the Type 99 Arisaka. And the sights were entirely different, a wing-protected inverted V-front sight and an adjustable tangent leaf rear sight graduated from 100 to 1200 meters. Production began at Yokosuka in late 1944. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, approximately 250 Type 4 rifles had been completed, with parts for perhaps another 100 rifles in various states of assembly. None saw combat. There wasn't time. The American advance was too fast, production too slow, logistics too disrupted by submarine warfare and strategic bombing. But the Type 4 rifle's very existence spoke to a recognition that Japanese military planners had been forced to accept, however grudgingly, that John Garand's grandma's gun, the rifle that old-school Marines had dismissed as too heavy and complicated, had fundamentally changed infantry warfare. And that Japan, despite its warriors' superior spirit and willingness to die, could not overcome the simple mathematical reality of sustained semi-automatic fire. The island of Guadalcanal in August 1942 was hell wearing a green mask. The 1st Marine Division had landed on August 7, seizing Henderson Field, a partly completed Japanese airstrip, in the opening move of America's first major offensive operation in the Pacific. The Marines who came ashore were still learning the business of amphibious warfare. Many had trained with the M1903 Springfield, the bolt-action rifle that had served the Corps for 3 decades. But by the time they established their defensive perimeter around Henderson Field, enough M1 Garands had been distributed to rifle companies that the weapon's effectiveness could be properly tested under the worst possible conditions. Those conditions arrived on the night of August 21. Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki, commanding 800 soldiers of the Japanese 28th Infantry Regiment, led his men in a direct assault on the Marine positions along the Tenru River. Ichiki was a veteran of combat in China and Manchuria. His men were well-trained, disciplined, and utterly confident in their superiority over American troops, whom Japanese propaganda had characterized as soft, undisciplined, and dependent on material comforts. The plan was straightforward: a nighttime infiltration followed by a mass bayonet charge that would overwhelm the Marine defenses through shock, speed, and the indomitable Japanese fighting spirit. The Marines, dug into defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, heard them coming. The jungle amplified sound in strange ways, sometimes deadening it, sometimes carrying it for hundreds of yards. The scrape of equipment. Voices whispering commands. And then the scream, "Banzai!" 800 men surged forward against an organized American defensive line anchored by machine guns, mortars, and riflemen armed with M1 Garands. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. The Marines opened fire at ranges where individual faces were visible in the darkness, 50 yards, 30 yards, close enough to smell the enemy, close enough to hear individual soldiers screaming. The M1 Garands created a drumbeat of sustained fire that never paused, never slackened. 8 rounds fired as fast as a trained Marine could pull the trigger. The en-bloc clip ejected. Another clip slammed home. 8 more rounds. The volume of fire was so intense that Japanese soldiers in the rear ranks stumbled over the bodies of those who had fallen in front. By dawn, the jungle floor was carpeted with dead. Marine patrols counted more than 800 Japanese bodies in and around the perimeter. Colonel Ichiki, realizing the magnitude of his defeat, committed suicide. Only a handful of his men survived to retreat back into the jungle. The Battle of the Tenru became a case study in what happened when outdated tactics met modern firepower, and a warning that the Japanese high command would take years to fully internalize. But the M1 Garand's impact wasn't limited to defensive actions against banzai charges. In the offensive, the rifle proved equally devastating. Marine rifle squads, armed with Garands and supported by Browning automatic rifles and machine guns, could generate such overwhelming suppressive fire that enemy defenders couldn't effectively return fire without exposing themselves to immediate destruction. In the jungles of the Solomon Islands, where visibility was often measured in tens of yards and ambushes could erupt at any moment, the ability to put rapid, accurate fire on a target meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Private First Class John Basilone, a machine gunner who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal, witnessed the Garand's effectiveness firsthand. During the night of October 24 through 25, 1942, when Japanese forces launched a massive assault against the Marine perimeter, Basilone watched riflemen armed with M1s cut down wave after wave of attackers. Between bursts from his Browning M1917 water-cooled machine gun, he saw individual Marines firing so rapidly that their rifles grew hot to the touch, the wooden handguards smoking in the humid air. The mathematical advantage was undeniable. A trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle could fire perhaps 15 to 20 aimed shots per minute. That same soldier, armed with an M1 Garand, could fire 40 to 50. In a squad of 12 men, 8 armed with Garands, that meant the difference between perhaps 120 shots per minute and 320 shots per minute. Against targets advancing across open ground, that additional firepower didn't just improve the odds, it fundamentally changed the nature of the engagement. And the rifle kept working. Marines who fought on Guadalcanal reported that their M1s functioned reliably despite being caked with mud, soaked with salt water, dropped in rivers, and subjected to the kind of abuse that would have disabled more delicate weapons. The gas system, once engineers at Springfield Armory had replaced the original gas trap design with a simpler gas port, proved remarkably resistant to fouling. The operating rod, riding beneath the barrel, was protected from debris. The en-bloc clip system, for all its quirks, meant that the magazine itself was an integral part of the receiver and couldn't be lost or damaged in combat. There were problems, of course. The weight, nearly 11 pounds loaded, was brutal during long patrols through jungle terrain. The length, 43.5 inches, made the rifle unwieldy in the close confines of bunkers and caves. Some Marines preferred the lighter M1 carbine for its handiness, despite its inferior range and stopping power. And there was the infamous M1 thumb, the painful injury that occurred when a careless soldier failed to remove his thumb quickly enough after loading a fresh clip, and the bolt slammed forward, crushing the thumb between bolt and clip. But these were minor complaints compared to the rifle's overwhelming advantages. And as the Marine Corps worked through its initial reluctance and fully embraced the M1, rifle companies became increasingly effective at their primary mission, closing with and destroying the enemy. The old Marines, the ones who had sworn by the Springfield rifle and its legendary long-range accuracy, gradually came around. Because however much they valued precision at 600 yards, combat in the Pacific was primarily fought at ranges under 300 yards. And at those ranges, volume of fire mattered more than minute of angle accuracy. By early 1943, after the conclusion of the Guadalcanal campaign, sufficient M1 Garands had become available to equip all frontline Marine units. The rifle that had been dismissed as Grandma's gun had become the weapon of choice for the Corps. And as the American advance across the Pacific gathered momentum, that choice would prove decisive in battle after battle. The island of Tarawa, assaulted by the 2nd Marine Division in November 1943, demonstrated the Garand's effectiveness in a different kind of fight. The landing beaches were swept by Japanese fire from concrete bunkers and fortified positions that had survived 3 days of naval bombardment. Marines wading ashore through chest-deep water took horrific casualties. But once they established a foothold on the beach and began clearing bunkers, the M1's firepower proved invaluable. Marines could lay down suppressive fire on bunker apertures while other Marines maneuvered to throw grenades or bring up flamethrowers. The sustained fire from multiple Garands kept enemy defenders' heads down long enough for the assault teams to close. The rifle also proved adaptable. The M7 rifle grenade launcher, a simple tube-and sight assembly that attached to the muzzle, allowed riflemen to launch fragmentation or anti-tank grenades at ranges up to 200 yards. On Tarawa, and later on Saipan and Peleliu, Marines used the M1 as a grenade launcher to suppress positions that were too well fortified for rifle fire but not important enough to warrant calling in artillery or air support. It wasn't an elegant solution. Firing grenades required removing the gas cylinder plug to prevent the gas system from cycling and potentially damaging the rifle, but it worked. By mid-1944, Japanese tactical doctrine had begun to evolve in response to the overwhelming firepower they faced. The fall of Saipan in July 1944, after a month of brutal fighting that cost nearly 30,000 Japanese lives, forced a painful reassessment. Banzai charges, once considered the ultimate expression of Japanese martial spirit, had become suicide missions that accomplished nothing except filling American body counts. General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, who would later command Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, explicitly forbade his men from conducting banzai charges. Instead, he ordered them to fight from prepared positions, to make the Americans pay for every yard of ground, to inflict maximum casualties while conserving Japanese forces as long as possible. This new defensive doctrine would be tested at Peleliu. The island of Peleliu, 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, sat in the Palau Islands approximately 500 miles east of the Philippines. American planners wanted the airfield on Polilliu to protect the flank of General Douglas MacArthur's planned return to the Philippines. Intelligence estimates suggested the island was defended by perhaps 10,000 Japanese troops. Actually, there were about 11,000, and that the operation would take 3 or 4 days. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, predicted it would be a quickie, rough but fast. It took 73 days. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had prepared the island's defense with meticulous care. Instead of defending the beaches with fixed positions, he fortified the Umurbergal Mountains, a coral ridge formation in the island's center that the Marines would come to call Bloody Nose Ridge. The caves and tunnels were connected by underground passages. Gun positions were mutually supporting. Entrances were angled to defend against grenades and flamethrowers. And Nakagawa had explicitly ordered his men, no banzai charges. Every position would be defended to the death, but there would be no wasteful frontal assaults. The 1st Marine Division landed on September 15, 1944. By nightfall, more than 1,100 Marines were casualties, with over 200 dead. The next 2 months would see some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War. And throughout that grinding, attritional battle, the M1 Garand proved its worth not through spectacular charges or dramatic moments, but through the steady, professional application of sustained firepower. Marines fighting in the coral ridges of Polilliu's mountains found themselves in terrain that seemed designed to negate every advantage American forces possessed. Tanks couldn't climb the steep coral slopes. Artillery had difficulty hitting reverse slope positions. Naval gunfire and air support were often useless against an enemy hiding deep in caves. What the Marines had was their infantry weapons, and the training to use them effectively. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the narrow defile and coral canyons of the Umurbergal Pocket, Marine rifle squads would establish a base of fire with their M1 Garands while other Marines maneuvered with satchel charges, flamethrowers, or bazookas. The sustained fire from multiple Garands, coordinated with machine guns and mortars, created the suppressive effect necessary for the assault teams to move. It was methodical, exhausting work. Each cave had to be sealed. Each bunker had to be destroyed. And the Marines had to do it while Japanese defenders fired from positions that were often invisible until the moment they opened fire. The M1's reliability under these conditions was crucial. Rifles caked with coral dust and limestone continued to function. The simple gas system, protected beneath the barrel, resisted fouling better than more complicated designs. And when rifles did malfunction, usually from broken extractors or damaged gas cylinder plugs, they could often be field repaired by company armorers and returned to service within hours. But perhaps the most telling testament to the M1's effectiveness came not from American combat reports but from Japanese sources. Captured documents and post-war interrogations revealed that Japanese soldiers, especially those who survived encounters with M1-equipped Americans, recognized the weapon's superiority. They couldn't understand how the Americans could generate such sustained fire from individual rifles. Some genuinely believed that every American infantryman was equipped with a light machine gun. The idea that the United States had armed its entire military with semi-automatic rifles, that such industrial capacity even existed, was almost incomprehensible to soldiers whose own logistics were breaking down under the strain of submarine warfare and strategic bombing. The Imperial Japanese Navy's attempt to copy the M1 with the Type 4 rifle was a tacit admission of this reality. But by late 1944, when production of the Type 4 began at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, it was far too late. American submarines had decimated Japanese merchant shipping. Strategic bombing had begun to disrupt industrial production. And the raw materials necessary for large-scale rifle production, high-quality steel, walnut or mahogany for stocks, precision machining equipment, were increasingly scarce. The 250 Type 4 rifles that were completed before Japan's surrender were a drop in the bucket compared to the more than 5 million M1 Garands that American industry had produced by war's end. The mathematics of industrial warfare are brutal and unforgiving. Japan entered the Second World War with a military doctrine that emphasized spirit over material, believing that superior morale and fighting skill could overcome disadvantages in equipment and supply. This belief was not entirely unfounded. Japanese forces had defeated the Russians at Port Arthur in 1905, had conquered Manchuria in the 1930s, and had achieved stunning victories in the opening months of the Pacific War. But those victories had been won against opponents who were either poorly organized, inadequately equipped, or strategically unprepared. The United States was none of those things. Between December 1941 and August 1945, American industry produced approximately 5.4 million M1 Garand rifles. Springfield Armory in Winchester Repeating Arms ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The production line that John Garand had designed, remember, he was a production engineer before he was a weapons designer, was optimized for mass production. Each rifle required approximately 140 individual parts, but those parts were standardized, interchangeable, and manufactured using automated processes that Japanese industry, with its reliance on skilled craftsmen and small batch production, simply could not match. This industrial capacity extended to every aspect of American military production. By 1944, the United States was producing more aircraft, more ships, more tanks, more trucks, and more ammunition than all the Axis powers combined. The M1 Garand was simply one component of an overwhelming material advantage that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate and could not counter. When captured Japanese soldiers asked how America could afford to arm every infantryman with a machine gun, they were really asking a deeper question: how could any nation possess such staggering industrial might? The answer lay in decisions made decades earlier, in the investment in standardized manufacturing, in the development of assembly line production, in the creation of a skilled workforce capable of rapid training and deployment. John Garand's rifle succeeded not just because it was a good design, though it was, but because it was a design that could be mass-produced reliably and maintained in the field by ordinary soldiers with minimal training. That combination, effectiveness and producibility, was the hallmark of American weapons development in the Second World War. But the human cost of the Pacific War extended far beyond industrial statistics. The Marines who fought on Peleliu suffered 6,500 casualties in 73 days of combat. The 1st Marine Division, which had landed on September 15 with 17,000 men, was so badly mauled that it remained out of action until the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. Japanese casualties were even more horrific. Of the approximately 11,000 defenders of Peleliu, only 202 were captured. The rest died in the caves and bunkers of Bloody Nose Ridge, or in the final, desperate counterattacks that Nakagawa authorized before he committed suicide on November 24. And Peleliu was just one island. Iwo Jima, invaded in February 1945, cost 26,000 American casualties in 36 days. Okinawa, the last major amphibious operation of the war, cost 50,000 American and more than 100,000 Japanese and Okinawan civilian casualties in 82 days of fighting. The M1 Garand was present at every one of these battles, in the hands of Marines and soldiers who used it to deadly effect. But the rifle didn't make the fighting easier or less terrible. It simply made American forces more effective at their mission, closing with and destroying an enemy who refused to surrender. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army in Europe during the final year of the war, wrote a letter to Major General Levin H. Campbell on January 26, 1945. In that letter, Patton offered what would become perhaps the most famous testimonial ever given to a military weapon. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. Patton's assessment was based on extensive combat experience in North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. His soldiers had used the M1 in every conceivable environment: desert heat, Italian mud, the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen forests of the Ardennes. And in every environment, the rifle had performed. It kept working when other weapons failed. It gave American infantry a firepower advantage that translated directly into battlefield success. Patton, never a man prone to understatement, genuinely believed that John Garand's rifle was the finest infantry weapon in the world. He wasn't wrong. The M1 Garand would continue in American service long after the Second World War ended. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, American soldiers responded with the same rifles they had carried against Germany and Japan. The fighting in Korea tested the M1 under conditions even harsher than those of the Pacific. The Korean winter of 1950 through 51 brought temperatures that dropped to 20 and 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Lubricants froze. Metal became so cold it would freeze skin on contact. And yet Marines fighting their way out of the chosen reservoir found that their M1 Garands, stripped of all lubricant and run bone dry, continued to function when other weapons failed. The rifle soldiered on through the 1950s, gradually being replaced by the M14, a weapon that John Garand himself helped develop before his retirement from Springfield Armory in 1953. The M14 retained the basic operating system of the M1 but added a detachable 20-round box magazine and selective fire capability. It was, in essence, the M1 Garand evolved for a new generation of warfare. But even after the M14's adoption in 1957, M1 Garands remained in service with National Guard and Reserve units until the early 1980s. And throughout those decades of service, the rifle maintained the reputation it had earned in the desperate battles of 1942 and 43, reliable, powerful, effective. The weight that old-timers had complained about became reassurance, a hefty rifle that absorbed recoil and stayed on target. The en-bloc clip system that critics had called complicated became second nature to trained soldiers, who could reload in under 2 seconds without taking their eyes from the target. Even the distinctive ping of the ejecting clip, which legend claimed alerted enemy soldiers to an empty rifle, though combat veterans universally dismissed this as myth, became an iconic sound of American arms. John Cantius Garand never received royalties for his rifle's design. As a government employee working at Springfield Armory, all his patents belonged to the United States Army. Congress attempted to grant him a $100,000 reward in recognition of his contribution to the war effort, but the legislation died in committee. Garand received various honors and awards: the Gold Medal for Meritorious Service in 1941, recognition from foreign governments, honorary doctorates from universities, but he never profited financially from the weapon that bore his name. He didn't seem to mind. Garand was, by all accounts, a modest man who took satisfaction in work well done rather than in public recognition or financial reward. He had given his adopted country a weapon that helped save democracy from fascism. That was enough. He continued working at Springfield Armory until his retirement, contributing to the development of the M14 and various other weapons projects. When he died on February 16, 1974, at the age of 86, his obituaries noted that the rifle he had designed had served American forces in 3 wars and had been, in General Patton's words, the greatest battle implement ever devised. The story of the M1 Garand is not simply the story of a rifle. It's the story of how industrial capacity, engineering excellence, and strategic foresight combined to give American forces a decisive advantage in the Second World War. It's the story of ordinary soldiers, Americans, Filipinos, Marines, who learned to trust a weapon that didn't look or function like anything they had trained with, and who used that weapon to devastating effect against an enemy that had underestimated both the rifle and the men who carried it. And it's the story of a fundamental shift in military technology, from the bolt-action rifles that had dominated warfare since the 1890s to the semi-automatic and automatic weapons that would define modern combat. The M1 Garand wasn't the first semi-automatic rifle. Various designers had experimented with the concept since the late 19th century. But it was the first truly successful semi-automatic rifle to be issued as a standard infantry weapon to the military of a major power. It set the template that all subsequent battle rifles would follow: gas-operated, magazine-fed, reliable under field conditions, and producible at industrial scale. The rifle that old Marines had dismissed as Grandma's gun in 1941 had become, by 1945, the weapon that every American infantryman trusted with his life. Japanese soldiers, who had begun the war believing that spirit could overcome material, ended it desperately trying to copy the weapon that had shattered their armies. And the production lines at Springfield Armory in Winchester, staffed by workers who never saw combat but whose labor was essential to victory, kept running day and night, turning out rifles that would arm a generation of Americans fighting to preserve freedom. Private First Class Miguel Santos survived Bataan, though he didn't survive the war. He died on the Bataan Death March, one of thousands who perished in that atrocity. His M1 Garand, serial number unknown, was confiscated by Japanese forces and likely shipped to Japan for technical analysis. Perhaps it ended up at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, studied by the engineers who were trying to reverse engineer their own version. Perhaps it was lost or destroyed in the chaotic final months of the war. But the story Miguel Santos began on that blood-soaked night in January 1942, the story of how American semi-automatic rifles changed the nature of infantry combat, continued in the hands of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and Marines who carried the M1 Garand across the Pacific and into Japan itself. They carried it up the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. They carried it through the mud and horror of Okinawa. And when the war finally ended, when Japanese officials signed the instruments of surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, the Marines' standing honor guard carried M1 Garands. The rifle that had been derided as too heavy, too complicated, too newfangled for serious military use had become the symbol of American military power. And rightly so. Because in the final analysis, the M1 Garand represented everything that American industry and ingenuity could achieve when properly mobilized, a weapon that was innovative, reliable, mass-producible, and devastatingly effective in the hands of trained soldiers. General Patton was right. It was the greatest battle implement ever devised. Not because it was perfect, no weapon is, but because it worked when it needed to work, in the hands of the men who needed it, at the moment in history when the survival of free societies hung in the balance. That's not hyperbole. That's simply history, told through the story of a rifle that weighed 9.5 pounds, fired 8 rounds without needing to work a bolt, and helped win the Second World War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.